Thank you. So I'm Shuran from Harvard. I want to first thank the organizer for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. So I'm going to talk about a joint work with Yilin Chen, who is my advisor at Harvard, and also with Haifeng Xu. So he was a postdoc at Harvard and now a faculty at University of Virginia. So as people who study economics and computation, we know a lot about how to sell items, but we don't know that much about how to sell a piece of information. For example, like flight tracker, like FlightAware, may want to sell the flight delays to the travelers. So the problem of like selling information has been studied by Babayev et al., who is just sitting over there, in 2012. So they gave some very nice results when the buyer has like unlimited budget. But based on the results, we found that we probably really want to consider budget-constrained buyers when we sell information. So I'm going to show that why we want to consider budget by an example. So suppose now Yilin wants to travel from Boston to New York to give a talk, and she can make it on time if the flight delays no more than 4 hours. And based on some historical data and the weather, she believes that the delay is uniformly distributed between 0 and 10 hours. And now she needs to make a choice. She can choose to wait for the flight, or she can go to take a train instead. So this is how her utility is going to look like. So if she chooses to wait and the delay is higher than 4 hours, then she will have an infinite loss. She never wants that to happen. And if she takes a train, then she will need to pay like $100 for the ticket. If she does not know any other information, then the better choice would be to take a train to avoid like this infinite loss. But if she can know the exact delay by maybe a flight tracker, then she can save the money when the delay is lower than 4 hours. So in expectation, this will save her like $40. So if Yilin is risk neutral, she should be willing to pay up to $40 for this piece of information. Now consider a flight tracker that knows the exact delay and wants to sell it to the travelers. And there are 2 possible buyers with different loss when they miss the flight, miss the talk, and slightly different beliefs about the flight delay. So the number here are not really important. What's important is the follows. So if we assume the buyer has like unlimited budget, then the optimal mechanism will look like this. So the seller will want to charge more than $200,000 when the delay is lower than 4 hours, and he will pay the buyer for more than $200,000 when the delay is higher than 4 hours. I probably won't be able to prove to you this is optimal. Please just trust me. It looks something like this. But the expected payment is much lower. So the expectation, the payment is only like $250. This is also the buyer's expected gain from knowing this delay in this problem. So if Yilin now only has like $100,000 in her pocket, she will have to refuse this offer because she cannot afford this like $200,000 payment. But if the seller directly charge like $200 for this delay, and she will actually be willing to pay for it, and that would be a win-win situation for both the buyer and the seller. So in this work, we try to avoid this type of mechanism by adding the missing assumption that the buyer is budget constrained, which is unfortunately true for most of us. And we are able to find quite simple optimal mechanism. And this optimal mechanism can be computed by polynomial-size linear program. This actually improves the previous result when there is no budget constraint, in which they need like exponential size linear program to compute the optimal mechanism. So adding budget constraints actually makes the mechanism design problem easier. So this gives another reason to consider like budget constraint buyers. So I'll first walk you through the model. Hopefully it's not going to be very painful based on the previous example. So there is a buyer, information buyer, who cares about an unknown state of the world, denoted by omega here. So for example, the flight delay. And he needs to choose an action, and his utility is going to depend on both the action and the state of the world. And the buyer has a private type that represents his belief about the state of the world and his utility function. And buyer also has a private budget. So if you really don't like this slide, you can just think there's a traveler who needs to choose to wait for the flight or take a train, and he has a private belief about how long the flight is going to delay, and also a private loss and a private budget. And there's the information seller who can fully observe the state of the world, and he has a budget. He also has a budget can be used to run the mechanism. And we consider the most standard for information setting. So the seller knows the utility function for each private type, and also the distribution of the buyer's type and budget jointly with the state of the world. And his goal is to sell the state of the world to maximize his expected revenue. Then the problem is, what are the mechanisms this seller can possibly use? This is actually one of the major differences between selling information and selling items, because the seller can actually sell like some partial information to the buyer. To be more formal, the seller can like give the buyer a random show the buyer the value of a random variable that's correlated with the state of the world. So for example, so this is example of a random variable that reveals the state of the world with probability 2/3. So the seller can like tell the buyer, when the delay is no more than 4 hours, I'll tell you everything's good with probability 2/3, and I'll tell you the opposite with probability 1/3. And he'll do the same when the delay is higher than 4 hours. So if at the beginning the buyer believes that the good event and the bad event are equally likely, then after seeing this random variable, he will like believe one of the outcome is more likely to happen. So he will gain some information about the state of the world. Then a very natural mechanism that the seller can use to improve his revenue is to give a menu of partial information like this, and charge and set different prices for these partial informations. But in this work, we actually allow the seller to design even more complicated mechanisms. So, as in the previous work, so the seller can review the information in multiple rounds, and the seller can interact with the buyer. So, like in each round, the seller can give the buyers some partial information, and he can also ask the buyer for some information about his private type and budget, or he can charge the buyer some amount of money. So I'm not going into the details of this multiple round mechanism, because we actually show that we don't need to, it's not necessary for the seller to use multiple round mechanism. What he needs to do is just to recommend actions to the buyer and then charge some prices for these recommendations. So we call like a mechanism that does this a consulting mechanism. So a consulting mechanism will works like this. So the mechanism will first ask the buyer to report his type and also deposit his budget. And according to this type and budget, the seller will give the buyer like different recommendations. So the seller will first look at the value of this the state of the world and randomly decide an action to recommend to the buyer, and also amount of refund. So he can one example is that when the delay is no more than 4 hours, the seller will recommend the buyer to wait. Recommend with probability 2/3 that for the buyer to the buyer that ask him to wait and refund like T1. And when the delay is higher than 4 hours, he will like recommend him to take a train with probability 2/3 and refund another amount of money. So here, the recommendation together with this payment can be seen as a piece of partial information about like the state of the world. And finally, the amount of a refund is either 0 or the buyer's budget plus the seller's budget. So in the end, either the seller gives the buyer all his money or the buyer gives the seller all his money. This property is important for the optimal mechanism to be like efficiently computable. So I'll quickly show you how. So we proved that there always exists a incentive compatible and individually rational consulting mechanism that maximize the seller's revenue. So here incentive compatible means that the buyer is always going to prefer the recommendation when he truthfully reports. And individual rational means that in expectation, the buyer should be willing to participate. So I'll quickly show you how we proved this theorem. So our proof consists of 2 main steps. We first show that there always exists a optimal one-round mechanism. And this optimal one-round mechanism can be computed by a linear program with exponentially many variables and exponentially many constraints. So I'll skip the proof for this step, but focus on the second step, in which we further reduce the one-round mechanism to the consulting mechanism that can be computed with polynomial-size linear program. So this is how we reduce the one-round mechanism to consulting mechanism. So we first write down the linear program that has, first write down the exponential size linear program that computes the optimal one-round mechanism. And we compute the dual LP of this LP. And we found that a lot of variables in this dual LP can be removed without changing the value, without changing the optimal objective value. So we get a reduced size dual LP. And then we compute the dual of this dual. So we get a linear program that has a very similar structure to the original LP, but with a much smaller size. Then we look at this final linear program, and what it says is basically there are only two possible payments. Either the seller give all his money to the buyer, or the buyer give all his money to the seller. And then based on this observation, we can convert any one round mechanism with two possible payments into a consulting mechanism. So this will complete our proof. Then the optimal consulting mechanism can be, we can formulate a polynomial-size linear program to compute the optimal consulting mechanism. So the variables is just the probability to recommend the actions and refund a certain and refund 0 or all the budgets. And we can use that variable to so we can write the expected revenue as a linear function of this variable using these variables as well as the individual rationality constraint and the incentive compatibility constraint. So to summarize, we consider selling information to budget constraint buyers, and we're able to find very simple optimal mechanisms for this problem, and it can be computed by polynomial-size linear program. And in this talk, I talk about the case that the buyer's type can be correlated with the state of the world, and we're actually able to have even simpler mechanism when the type is independent with the state of the world. Thanks, and that's all for this talk.
Questions?
Can you, in very short, tell us how it's simpler when the buyer type and the state of the world are uncorrelated?
So the question is, how does the mechanism look like when the type? Sure. In that case, the optimal mechanism can first charge a price. First charge a price and then give the buyer a recommendation. So in this, when the buyer's type is correlated with the state of the world, the optimal mechanism first give a recommendation and then charge a price, and that for different recommendation the price can be different. But for independent case, that he can first charge a price and give the recommendation. Yes.
Can you briefly describe how to write down the exponential size LP?
So the question is how the exponential size LP looks like. Okay. So this is a little bit difficult. So it's basically with the objective function is still the expected revenue, and the constraints are incentive compatibility constraint and individual rationality constraint and the budget constraint. And so, yes, so the constraints are when we need the buyer will have higher expected utility when he truthfully reports, and he should be willing to, his expected utility is always higher than 0. and also how much he pays is no more than his budget, something like that. Any other questions? Okay, thanks.